Okay. Another important concept in TOGAF is scoping the architecture activity. See, it's very important to uh, define a clear cut scope for the architecture activity because uh, the availability of resources are always in a given limit. So, you need to define the architecture activity in that given limit. For example, if the length of project is 1 year, you cannot have a architecture activity of 3 years. That is of no use. So it's very important to scope the architecture activity. And the scoping doesn't mean that you always need to limit the scope. It also means that you need to clearly define the stakeholder concerns and the objectives of stakeholders in that given limit. So that is also a concern that scoping means you need to include the uh, correct requirements within that scope. So the scope is directly proportional with the available resources, and so it's more of a issue of feasibility. So if the resources are limited and you define a very huge architecture, so that architecture is not feasible in that scenario. So it's important to define a feasible architecture with the given set of resources. When we talk about scoping the architecture activity, we define or we scope the architecture activity in four ways: breadth, depth, time period, and architecture domain. So these are the four, you can say, dimensions which are important for defining the or scoping the architecture activity. So, in case of breadth, we define the uh, extent of the enterprise considered for the architecture effort. So, let's say your architecture, your enterprise has, let's say, n domains, n number of domains. So, what all, let's say 20 domains are there or 20 departments are there in your enterprise. For example, in a ERP based system, let's say you have various departments like HR, finance. So, what all uh, domains or what all departments are considered as part of the architecture activity? So, you considered HR and finance or payroll. So, these things are considered, but maybe there are a few other uh, domains like manufacturing or sales. So that is not considered as part of this architecture activity based on the availability of resources. So in case of breadth, we define the extent of the enterprise considered for the architecture activity. In case of depth, we consider the level of detail the architecting efforts are required. For example, we can go into uh, quite a details when we define the architecture activity. So, what level of detail is good for the architecture activity? So, let's say, let's consider the case of a HR based system. So, in this kind of a system, you can go into any extent. And another option is to uh, opt for a third party system also. So, what all level of details are required? I mean, for example, you can have uh, n number of reporting done for the HR. For example, you can find out how many times user updated his records. So that is one level of detail. But you can have similar number of details in other scenarios also. So what all details are required, what all reporting is required, and based on that you can create your framework. So in case of depth, we define the level of detail good for the architecture effort. In time period dimension, we scope the architecture activity in such a way that we try to find out the time period uh, that needs to be you know articulated for the architecture activity, and the time period defined, does it really makes sense to all the stakeholders? So let's say uh, we define an architecture activity of say 3 years. So I mean, developers can't wait for the completion of 3 years to start their development, or stakeholders can't wait. So maybe in this case we can have uh, you know uh, various levels of architecture, or maybe we can define transition architectures. So what all transition architectures will be there, what will be the time period of these architectures? So all these things will be defined as part of the time period. So in time period, we define the overall uh, time period required to articulate the architecture vision, and we try to also find out like what all transition architectures are required, and if there are any transition architectures involved, what will be the time period of individual architecture. The four dimension is scoping in scoping the architecture activity is architecture domain. Ideally, a complete enterprise architecture activity should contain all the four domains, that is business, data, application and technology. But in real world scenario, that is not the case, and we sometimes need to rule out or skip one of the architecture activity, or we can even afford only one activity. So let's say the project requirement is only for data architecture activity, then we will opt for only data architecture activity and move on. So we customize the TOGAF framework based on the requirement. Thank you.